All right, let's move on to our next speaker. Frank Dempsey will give us an update on his build of a 12.5-inch telescope.
Okay, thanks, Paul, for that introduction. And as you can see in the title, it's basically an update of the project I'm working on. And so I'll just point out some details that might be relevant. And I'll start off with some very preliminary basics about what type of telescope I'm making. So just so that everybody's aware of what a Newtonian telescope is, it simply is a concave mirror which focuses incoming starlight toward the eyepiece, and it's enclosed in a tube, and it has a mount of some sort, and that's really the basic telescope that I'm making. It's a simple Newtonian. There are far more complicated telescopes that people can make and do make, but this is a simple Newtonian. So there's a few other pieces of hardware involved, and that's just basically a mirror cell which holds the mirror and allows it to be collimated, and a diagonal mirror holder which is a 45-degree holder to direct the focused starlight out to the side toward the focuser, which holds an eyepiece. And it's really nothing more complicated than that. Those main components. So the 12.5-inch mirror is a pretty big project with a lot of work and a lot of complications. So it's really helpful to have built a telescope before that. It's a practice telescope. My practice mirror was an 8-inch mirror or 20-centimeter mirror that I made several years ago. And you see it pictured on the right, in that telescope I have on the right. And that's a long focus Newtonian, but it is it's been my favorite telescope since I built it, and it delivers really sharp, crisp images. I just love looking through it, especially because it's a mirror that I made with my hands and caused everything to work together. So that's been my favorite telescope since I built it a couple of years ago. But before I built that, my previous favorite telescope was another telescope that I built about 45 years ago. Now it's a 6-inch or 15-centimeter Newtonian you see pictured on the left. So they both deliver really sharp, crisp images. That's because they're so-called f10 or long focus Newtonians. So with that bit of experience, I decided it's time to go ahead and build a 12.5-inch telescope, which is quite a bit more work. And I'll share some details with it to try to give you some idea of what's going on. And so the bulk of the telescope making is the mirror. So the mirror takes a good 99.9% of the effort and time and work involved in making the whole telescope. And so making the mirror involves grinding the mirror starting off with rough grinding with 60 or 80 grit, which is pretty rough grit for grinding glass, down to really fine grinding, 1,000 or 1,200 grit. It's pretty fine grit. And then after that, there's a lot of hours to spend on polishing with a pitch slap. And there's also a lot of optical testing to do, followed by corrections to correct the little errors that creep in. And so the idea is to continue on with polishing until all those imperfections eventually become insignificant, and I decided they are acceptable. At that point, it's finished, and it's time to send the mirror for coating, either send it out for aluminizing or else get a Sprayon kit. Anyway, it'll be ready for the telescope tube after that. And so the telescope tube or frame has the job of holding everything to allow incoming starlight to focus into the eyepiece with really good collimation. So it requires a mirror cell to hold that mirror. It requires a secondary mirror and spider vane set at a 45-degree angle to direct that focusing starlight out to the side of the tube to the focuser, and of course an eyepiece. And so the tube for a 12.5-inch telescope is not so easy to find or buy or make, and I decided it was easy to make a so-called serrated truss. And you see it pictured on the right. And so it's a sizable enough structure, but I decided to put together a prototype just made from 2x2 lumber. So I think of it as a lumber wagon. So that thing is hefty enough, but it's a good prototype to get everything right until I decide everything is just the right size, orientation, and then I will finish it off with spending money on aluminum tubes for it. And the other pictures just show some woodworking that's involved in putting together that wood structure. So there are some components to buy or make, and so some people make all of them. If I can buy a mirror cell and a secondary mirror and holder and the focuser, I would save a lot of time. So I actually did buy them. I found them used at swap tables at Starfest event and other places, and so I'm basically making the tube or the frame structure here and the mirror, and the other little components I was able to buy. So the mirror is the bulk of the work, and so you see it shown here on top of the pitch slap. So polishing simply involves pushing that mirror back and forth for hours and hours and hours across the pitch slap. So if that doesn't sound like much fun, you're right. It's not much fun, but it's really a tedious job. But it's pretty necessary to be very careful and precise about every step of polishing to avoid getting grit or sand or anything that could scratch it or getting other problems with it. So here's one of the problems that comes up is that the pitch slab, which is a layer of pitch with channels in it, eventually falls apart, breaks apart. So here you see it, the facets, as those squares are called, breaking off. So that's one case. You see another case here where I've polished so much that the edges are flaking off. So at that point, I have to make a new pitch slab. So the pitch slab is easy enough to make after I've done a few of them, but the first time somebody makes a pitch slab, it's pretty darn exasperating. However, it's fairly easy to remove the broken pitch slab. Comes off simply with a hammer, put it into a pot, into a melting pot, melt it into a liquid, almost like taffy, and pour it onto the new mold for the new pitch slab. And so here it is here, and eventually pull off the tape around it, and looks like quite a mess, and it is an awful mess to make, yes. But you see the quarter-inch thick or so pitch slab there pictured there, and that's the new pitch slab. So after that, have to channel it. This is another very tedious, exasperating job. It takes hours to do. However, it's part of a task, so that's fine. More polishing. Some optical testing is required, and this is just an illustration of a so-called Ronchi test. So it's fairly easy, or at least possible, to photograph and show an image of it. It shows the bars, and shape and orientation of the bars give quite a bit of information about the shape of the mirror as it's being polished. That's one test. Another test is a star test. And so here I've pulled a lumber wagon out, set it up on some sticks, and it's oriented toward Polaris. And so it's fairly easy to set it point toward Polaris, and the uncoated mirror can reflect enough light into the eyepiece to allow me to evaluate the image of the focused star. And that's the idea of the star test. So it also shows quite a lot of information at each stage of polishing as it becomes more and more perfect, or less, or the errors become smaller and smaller. And so that's a couple of tests involved. I mentioned that there were some other hardware pieces involved in making the telescope, and I mentioned that I managed to buy them. So you see the diagonal holder and spider vane on the upper left, and the mirror cell at the back of the telescope in the lower right, and lower left shows the focuser that I put onto it. And the rest is just pieces of lumber slapped together in a prototype format to make that tube. And eventually, of course, or can replace it with appropriate materials, marine plywood for the diagonal cage at the front end, and aluminum tubes for the main frame. But meanwhile, it's a prototype set up. And one other detail to point out is I need a finder scope, and this is a little 4-inch or 10 centimeter Newtonian scope that I built a few years ago. I think it'll be a great little finder scope for this 12.5-inch scope. So I built this one a few years ago. It's also nice to look through and use, and so this will be a good use for that scope. That's the finder. So I also need a mount, and I managed to find this mount a few years ago. It's one of the options I'll use for an equatorial mount. It needs a bit of mounting on top of a tripod or pedestal still, but it'll eventually serve the purpose. It's an ancient buyer's mount for anybody familiar with buyer's mount, about say maybe 20, 30 years ago. Fairly high precision piece of machining, so I think that'll handle the job pretty well. So that's my current plan. So I just wanted to continue off with a few other little details, and there are lots of styles of homemade telescopes that people make, and you see some pictured here from the Stellafane annual telescope making event convention. Some telescopes that people make look like really fine furniture, and so really good wood crafting, and so I'm definitely not doing that. Some are more functional and just have structural frames that hold everything together, and that's more like what I will be making, and my telescope will look like. So there are different sorts of mounts in use too, and a lot of people are familiar with the Dobsonian mounting for telescopes of this size, and the same size telescope can also be mounted on the German equatorial, and there are other mounting styles as well. The point about the pictures at the bottom of the frame are that, in my opinion, a homemade telescope shouldn't require a crane or a forklift to move around. But look, some are pretty hefty and pretty big. And so you see the one on the lower right, that's actually a telescope that Clyde Tombaugh built. And if the name Clyde Tombaugh rings a bell, he's a man that discovered what was called planet Pluto back about almost 90 years ago. What was called the planet Pluto. Anyway, this was his backyard telescope that he had after he retired. And this is his backyard telescope at his home in New Mexico. And so, pretty hefty telescope, but it's not really the size of structure that I'm really aiming to build. But some people do build pretty big structures and frames for their telescope. So, with that bit of an overview, I mentioned that the presentation is simply an update. So I'm not done yet. And so I still have a lot of polishing to do. And so that's the current update. I have a lot of polishing to do. And then after that, I'll be ready to parabolize the mirror. And that may take 5 minutes if I'm really, really good. Or it may take months and months of corrections to do to correct little errors I put in while I'm trying to parabolize it. So we'll see what happens there. But that should be fun. Once that's done, it's time to get the mirror coated. The tube frame structure that I have, it'll be eventually, once I've got everything set for the correct balance point and the correct length and so on, have to modify it a little bit, then I will make those little corrections. It'll be time to make the final version, most likely with aluminum tubes. And the mount, I have an equatorial mount. I'll start off with that mount that I showed you. Still have to mount that equatorial head, but that'll be the first estimate, and then I may be able to come up with other designs that I may have showed you in some illustrations for a more portable sort of mount that may be a bit easier to handle. So it's an interesting project ahead, and I'm still in the polishing phase, but that's the update. So I should just mention as a final closing note that in case I've managed to fool anyone into believing I know what I'm talking about, anybody wants to get involved in doing this as well, there are quite a lot of resources around. There are some books on the market and in libraries and so on about telescope making. So a lot of these books can still be found. They're available, and some are maybe out of print now, but they're all pretty handy for giving quite a lot of information about how to build a telescope from scratch if you want to. And a few other minor resources online. Not really minor isn't the correct word. There's some significantly good resources and a lot of YouTube videos now showing how to go about the process of tricky details like grinding the mirror and polishing and pouring pitch laps. So I recommend stellafane.org. It has quite a lot of links to a lot of resources. And the cloudynights.com forums for telescope making are also pretty good. A lot of information there. One little group that's been pretty handy here in Southern Ontario for linking together telescope makers here in Southern Ontario is, or was called the Focal Point. It was a Yahoo group. So Yahoo groups won't be around for much longer, possibly another month. But you could check that out if you want to get involved right away. That it may be an immediate but not long-term resource to check out. And so those are a few resources. But in summary, I'll just point out that it's ongoing and it's an interesting and challenging hobby. So that's all I have to say for now. That's the update. Until next time. So we're finished.
That's quite an undertaking and definitely a labor of love. Lots of work. So let's go to questions. Blake, what do we have?
Okay, thanks. I have a question. My first one is, have you considered silvering the mirror as opposed to aluminum? I've heard a lot of people talking about that silvering can be done practically at home. More and more people are doing it. There's some of the ATM or amateur telescope maker groups starting to do that, and silver, as you know, has better reflectivity than aluminum. So are you set on aluminum?
No, it's a good question. It's an open question because, as you know, the silvering process is fairly new. Maybe it's been around several years. And maybe several years ago, the company, whose name I forget offhand, started selling these home silvering kits. And so far, there's been some pretty good reports. One question to consider, one reason why it's an open question for me is because how good will those coatings be in, say, 10 years or even 5 years? I know that if I spend the extra money on aluminizing and drive the mirror to Montreal for instance, to get aluminized, it'll probably be a very good mirror in 10 years because I have several other mirrors, like my 8-inch and 10-inch mirror, that are pretty darn good condition. They're aluminized by Norman Fulham in Montreal. And so that's a good, fairly reliable option. The new angel coating process, to me, is fairly new, but I think it's an open question. And if I hear more reports about it, that'll be one reason to consider it, especially if it's low enough cost. It's also a do-it-yourself aspect to another aspect of a telescope making process, a do-it-yourself process. So it's an open question because don't know enough about it yet. Hasn't been around long enough, but it's definitely an option. And the other option that is known and reliable and maybe worth money is getting it aluminized and overcoated. So simply is an open question for now.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, some people are talking about that they can do the silvering themselves at home on the order of $20 or $30. So even if it would have to be recoated, say every 2-3 years, you know, it might be a much cheaper route to go. Okay, thanks. The YouTube visitor Gay10 asked, what's the focal ratio for the mirror?
It's close to f6. So that's the short answer. So I didn't mention it. I cut all numbers and figures out of the presentation to decrease the sleepiness aspect of it for people who don't like numbers. But I left it out because it's fairly clear to see that when I had the frame tube standing up beside me, you see it's roughly my height. And so it's for a 12-inch mirror, it's just under f6, approximately f5.8 or some little number that changes because I'm constantly polishing it. But you can say approximately f6. So the main point is that it's a reasonably manageable size. I should point out too, just in case you find it amusing, that when I started off making the mirror, I thought another f10 would be a spectacularly, phenomenally amazing planetary telescope to make a 12-inch f10 Newtonian. And then I was at a meeting or a conference or somewhere and mentioned to somebody in the early stages of branding the mirror, and somebody mentioned, you know, Frank, you might want to be careful when you get older, how high you want to be standing on a ladder in the dark when you get older. And so I came home and I thought, maybe a shorter telescope is more manageable and less risky at night. So that's why it's down to its current size. So f6 seems to be about the maximum length I can get away with. So that's why it's approximately f6.
Will that mean that you need a coma corrector?
Short answer, don't know yet. From what I can tell, probably not. Depends on, of course, on what I want to do with it. If I find the star images, if I just use it for, say, something like variable star observing and find star images are fine the way they are, I probably wouldn't spend the extra money. But you never know if I come across a used one or decide that it's worthwhile, and it becomes a critical issue on some sort of objects where there's coma appearing in some objects that I look at, then that would justify it. So right now, it's another open question. It's one of these questions that can delay until I have a telescope built.
Right. Speaking of which, a few of us want to know about the time and effort and cost. Of course, you're partway through the project right now, but do you know how many hours you've spent so far? Do you keep track of that?
I stopped keeping track because it's quite a lot of hours. I could just generally say I started a few years ago. And so I finished my 8-inch scope a few years ago. I started on the 12-inch. So it gets delayed by other priorities, like, for instance, gardening season. A big distraction this year that got in the way of a lot of polishing this past summer was a lot of good observing conditions and solar system objects that made it worthwhile to go out of my way. A comet, a bright planet nearby, a lot of great observing this past summer took priority. And so various things take priority, and so you can only say a lot of hours. And so if you want to know how that compares with, you could generally ask the question, is it saving a lot of money by making a telescope rather than buying one? Well, maybe in total dollars, buying a 12-inch scope, I could probably save a little bit by making one, since the cost isn't very much. They had all the materials, grinding and polishing materials and so on. Didn't really, from the leftover from the previous project, didn't really buy anything except for the mirror blank. And that might have cost me, I forget, maybe a few $100s at most, a few years ago. And as the other parts that I bought for it, focuser wasn't a really cheapo piece of hardware, and the other pieces of hardware I bought weren't really too expensive either. So it's not really an expensive project so far. I think the only real main expense coming up will be the aluminizing that's used to get it aluminized. Otherwise, I could generally say a lot of hours and not too many dollars. That's probably the best, most general answer I can give to your question.
And Paul Markov asked about the Sprayon kit. Is that very inexpensive compared to sending it off to Norman Fullen?
So I hadn't looked into it too closely, so I couldn't get too specific, but the Angel coating kit for coating mirrors does cost less money, yes. I have looked into it a couple of times, not for a few months. I think it was last year's cellophane where it was demonstrated. And I looked into it after that and I thought, yeah, pretty good. It could be worthwhile. So it is cheaper than aluminizing, especially when I factor in the cost of driving there twice, or even worse, shipping the mirror there, because it's pretty darn heavy.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if the cost of that home silvering kit is less than the cost of shipping the mirror to Montreal or Sudbury or anywhere. But anyways, it is definitely was lower cost, much lower cost than aluminizing when I checked into it maybe about a year ago or so. I could also mention that I have looked into the chemistry of another silvering process, an ancient silvering process, which some people do promote or do mention on their websites. I forget exactly where offhand or who exactly it was, but I have looked into it. It is quite possible to do my own silvering without buying that kit. As long as I'm careful about chemistry, fine. I've worked as a lab chemist in the past, and I have no problem with it. More amateur astronomers wouldn't necessarily want to do their own home silvering, but I could do that. So I have looked into that. It would be not very expensive at all. But my question is, how long does the coating last? Especially for me, it gets wet or dew coated quite a lot when I'm out observing them. So that's one reason why I think that the aluminizing, including overcoating, would be good value for lasting for a long time. In general, the cost of the silvering kit is less than the cost of aluminizing. Yes.
Yep. Okay. That mirror blank that you got, you said it was heavy. How much does it weigh and how thick is it? Leo 2 Calf asked that.
So it's 20 pounds or close to 10 kilograms. May or may not be heavy, but it is heavy because it's a very old mirror blank that was so-called full thickness. It was one of the castings from Corning glassware, when Corning glass used to, many decades ago, cast Pyrex blanks for amateur telescope makers when they used to cast Pyrex glass in Corning, New York. So it's one of those old mirror blanks, and there's still some around because there are some in attics or other places where people have started mirrors and not finished them, and they gradually become available as estates, houses get cleaned out, and so on. This sort of thing, they show up from time to time. But I was lucky to get it. It's far less costly, I think, than a more modern, newest generation composite or honeycomb mirror blank. I hate to even imagine the cost of them, but they would be much lighter, of course. So in general, in my opinion, it's quite heavy. It's vastly much heavier than my 8-inch mirror, which was sort of manageable. This 20-pound mirror, 20 pounds may or may not sound like a lot, but I wouldn't want to drop it on my toe or on the floor in the house or in a sink. I'd really break something. The mirror would probably survive because it's a pretty strong, hefty piece of glass. But anyway, that's his weight.
Okay, and consequently, does that drive how you're going to use the telescope? Are you planning to put this in an observatory, or is it going to be a portable telescope?
That's also an open question because I've chosen to use an equatorial mount. And so the mount that I showed a picture of briefly, the old buyer's mount that I picked up a few years ago, is not exactly what I would call portable. And the picture didn't even have the counterweights on it. So you talk about heavy weight, you're talking about the counterweights, which are not even in that picture. So it's not a portable mount at all. It'll be sitting in my yard. That's fine. Build an observatory around it. That's fine. You can set it in the backyard here. I also might possibly consider it using as a portable scope to take it to dark sky sites. And I may have briefly mentioned, I may not have mentioned that I showed you some other telescopes that people have made, mostly from the Stellafading website. But the included one or several of these that were in the 12-inch category that were fork type mounts that sit on the ground that people have built out of wood. And those ones I may decide to transition to that sort of mount. Or I may also have the German equatorial mount set up permanently in my backyard here with an observatory around it, and periodically take the scope out, build a portable mount for it, or a relatively portable mount that could be taken places, drop on the ground, and put the scope into it. So it would sit fairly low to the ground. It would be an equatorial mount. I just happen to like equatorials. I decided to do that instead of Dobsonian, just because I like tracking mounts. So it's a little bit of an open question, but it does have it does have a German equatorial mount waiting for it, so it'll be relatively permanent in that sense. But I do guess that I will be able to eventually build a separate mount for it because I like them and because it's a creative thing to do. Look into those other mounts and see if I can build one that will be portable and that I'll still be able to handle when I'm a few years older from now. So we'll see what happens. There are other options too. One of the options, of course, is to rent some observatory space at the CAO and leave it there, and go there on some dark periods and use it there. So there are other options as well, but in general, it's still an open question of how portable it will be.
Thank you. Does that Bayer's mount though require particular power? Am I guessing correctly that it needs 120 volts?
Yes. Short answer is yes. Longer answer is the previous owner replaced it with separate motors. The short answer is yes, because it's very similar to another older wires mount that I also have, which has 120 volt motors. And it's not a problem because I simply run an extension cord out. I can run an extension cord out, provide power to the telescopes in my backyard. The main one I need electricity for is one that I use for a project called photoelectric photometry. My other scopes to run on batteries. And so I've also found, funny as it may be, that I can get by quite well with not driving the telescope at all. So just when I've got the scope balanced well enough, it's easy, and the clutches back off enough, can move really freely when I've got things just right, and so I just move it freely in my hand. So except for requiring very high magnification, like that 8-inch f10 scope I showed you, pointed at Mars, for instance, it needs to be driven to maintain the field of view at very high magnification. So if I do that with a 12-inch scope, it's not a really long focal length, but if I use it at higher magnification, it'll certainly need to be clock driven, and the motors will have to be driven. But I may get away with just using it without even bothering to drive the motors. So it's still an open question there too.
Okay, understood. I had a comment that I wanted to make when you were showing the various books that you've used and recommended. A bit of bad news surfaced a short time ago that Willem Bell, one of the big publishers of do-it-yourself and ATM books, went out of business recently. So all the books by the Willem Bell publisher, those are going to be maybe harder to come by for the time being. So that's just a little FYI to share with people.
Yeah, I agree. It's a point. If somebody wants to buy a new book, it's a bit of a hassle now, of course. But the main point about ATM hardware and gear is that there's a fairly good a fairly good population of ATMers in North America, and so parts become available from time to time, including books. So it wouldn't be too hard to pick up a secondhand book because somebody has, say, built a scope, say, 20 years ago, eventually decides to declutter, and you see stuff that's been sitting around in somebody's house or shelf for years finally be put on sale, including some old parts that I showed you, say, for instance, a spider mount for the diagonal or a main mirror. So there's still some used ones available that come on sale from time to time that have been sitting around, similar with those old books. They're classic old books. And furthermore, some libraries have them. I wouldn't say how soon libraries will be open, not in the near future, maybe, but some of those books can probably be easily picked up secondhand. Several like Richard Berry's book, How to Build a Telescope, and some of the other ones, Darwin and Bell books, are probably popular enough that they are on the secondhand market. I'm just guessing. Because I see a lot of parts and hardware on the secondhand market for ATMers. It probably wouldn't be too hard to pick up some of those books. So it's not totally suicidal type news that Wilman Bell has gone out of business.
Cicely asked, now you've been doing this for a while, but she asked, through the process of designing and building telescopes and considering their history, have you had any moments or experiences that gave you a new appreciation of the craft?
Short answer is yes. Let me try to think of some examples I can quote in a hurry. I have to say that the best example would be with my 8-inch f10, looking at really crisp, in nights of ultra steady, seeing really crisp, sharp images of big objects like Saturn and its satellites and rings, or Mars right now this past couple of months, or the Moon, really give me an appreciation for the ability to finish off a good mirror and mount everything in good collimation and good support and make a good telescope out of it. Let me just give you one sub-example of that one that might help to illustrate the situation. And this was a few years ago when I was star testing that 8-inch mirror. It was uncoated. I had it out one morning, pointing at the Moon to check out the image of it, and I was almost surprised to see the focuser, which I had a plastic, a metal and plastic focuser on it. It's actually the focuser that you may have seen on that little 4-inch reflector that I might have illustrated. I thought I'll just put that onto the telescope as a temporary thing, and at least for star testing. And I was a little bit surprised to see that at a magnification of around 540, I could see the bending of that, the parts, and I could tell the turbulence in the image was from a little bit of thermal turbulence. I could see a little bit of turbulence from the turbulence in the air, the different layers of the air, and I could see a little bit due to the bending of the focuser as I tweaked the focus to get really sharp focus on a part of the Moon that was, a crisp silhouette along the terminator maybe. I was a little bit surprised to see the bending of the focuser because it was plastic parts and so on. And so then after that, I really, really appreciated the ability to make, use, and mount really good, high quality parts, all in a high quality configuration that maintains good collimation, good alignment. And that was how I chose to go with the Moonlight focuser, which you may not have recognized. The metal focuser I bought is not a cheap one. It's a very good one. It's a very well machined metal focuser. But partly because of that, I recognize the benefit of really well made and aligned and co-aligned parts all working together can give a really amazing good image. So that's just one example.
Thank you very much, Frank. That covers off our questions from the chat and the ones that I had. Very, very inspiring. All the hard work that you're doing on your own building gear. Okay, well, I'm glad to share it with you. And so
It's been a fun project. It's an ongoing fun project, so maybe we'll give you some updates sometime in the future.
All right, thanks again, Frank, and definitely come on back to and give us an update when the project is finished.